On today's podcast, it's a little bit of surprise for Dr. Poe. You guys bring him surprises all the time, I'm sure, in his practice helping you folks. I've got a little, almost 3 year old, and we've been sending our daughter to these ISR swimming lessons. I think it stands for Infant Something Rescue. It's super expensive, but apparently it like makes them, when they fall in the water, that they can doggy paddle and then turn and rest on their back, catch their breath, and then doggy paddles, basically so they don't drown. I mean, it's very interesting. And I don't go very often, but I was observing this time of the lessons are like 10 minutes long. So very short, but it's extremely intense because they pretty much drown this poor kid. They basically let him go for 4 seconds to 6 seconds. If you're a queasy parent, it's just way too long seeing this happen. I think that the cool thing about kids that age is they don't have the fear factor, or at least mine doesn't yet. And they're willing to try and they don't have all the turmoil upstairs. What I want to
Mm.
spring this on Paul is he's got kids that are a little bit older, and we're curious, and when does this kind of like fear factor or self doubt, the self critic, when does it manifest itself? And then ultimately, I think what we're getting to is we work with a lot of adults, whether it's investing off the beaten path or getting out of their comfort zone. It's adults are messed up and we have a lot of baggage. But I don't know, Paul, what is something that your kids have gotten out of their comfort zone recently?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to dive into this. So I think my kids have. I'm not sure. Forget when the last time you saw them. But they're 10 and 8 right now. See their differences and how they figure things out on their own outside of anyone trying to teach them anything. It's really fascinating.
Obviously, there's a best way of not drowning here that they teach. But same thing, they don't tell her to
Mm,
turn. It's more
yeah.
instinctual. They do reward when she does the right thing, but make it a point not to tell her to turn left or right. It is a little bit very intuitive, and eventually they'll figure it out. But I think the roadblocks that I see, even myself learning new things or getting involved in new things, is oh, this I'm suck at this, or I'm just not good at it, or that's just not there at this stage.
That's a really interesting way to teach someone how to swim. I can see the benefit of it. Yeah, you build up this inner intuition that kids have. And I think sometimes like nowadays, like that sort of just gets lost in this era of helicopter parenting and overprotectiveness and all the craziness that's going on in the world right now. I feel like parents in general are just more hands-on, which has benefits, but also a lot more anxious and a lot more protective around their kids, right? When you and I grew up, how many parents would put these locks on all the cabinets and put these gates everywhere? It's if you fell and you rolled down the stairs, you're gonna be okay, most likely. That's where our bones are soft. But nowadays, there's a whole market of devices and gadgets that are meant to protect kids. There is something cool to be said about what you're describing about how they're being taught to swim. But the caveat being that it's obviously a very supervised environment, and obviously no harm is going to come to the kids. But you just let their natural instincts kick in, give them a chance to figure it out on their own. And I think there's something really cool about that.
Part of this is there's obvious we all intuitively know that there's a fine line where you don't provide like rigid
Mhm.
instructions, yet there needs to be some guidance in this.
Yeah.
What was when do you think at some point where I guess that you've seen within your just 2 data points there that ego starts to be introduced in there and then they start to take themselves out of the game to some
Mm.
extent? Repetitions and practice eventually does lead to success unless
Yeah.
they give up or they take
Right.
themselves out of it.
My wife and I were very intentional about trying to let them figure things out on their own, even if it takes longer. But I think the value of letting kids figure things out on their own, like not stepping in too often, is that it builds up the self confidence with them to trust their gut and to trust their instincts. If they're not comfortable doing something, we'll try to respect that. We'll try to impose any sort of timeline and just believe that they're gonna figure it out on their own. It's gonna click at some point. And so we try not to force things, right? And similarly, we're pretty intentional about doing this when it comes to their emotions, right? So for example, if my son comes home one day and says, like, nobody wants to be friends with me, instead of immediately replying, "Oh, that's not true. So likable. There's no way that can be true." We're pretty intentional about responding with empathy and be like, "Oh, that sounds really hard. That stinks that you feel that way. Tell me more." We try to do this because if you immediately tell them that what they're feeling is wrong, then it actually ends up teaching them that, hey, my feelings, my gut reactions, I don't know if I should trust that or not. And we want them to be able to trust their inner gut, which is very similar to this idea of like basically throwing kids in the deep end in a supervised environment. Let them trust themselves because I think in the long run, when they're older and they're adults, you want them to trust themselves, right? And whether it's a son or daughter, if they're in a situation where someone's trying to push them to do something that they don't want or they're being peer pressured, you want them to be able to trust their intuition, their gut instinct that,
Or they're in a business where the odds are likely
yeah,
stacked against them. They need to have the
yeah.
inner confidence.
Whereas sometimes as parents, like we mean, but if we say, "Oh no, like that's you shouldn't feel that way." Of course, it's not true. If I think if we're too quick to do that, then we can actually inadvertently do them harm in the long run. But yeah, so
Yeah.
it's a balancing act. So that's something that my wife and I we try to pretty intentional about doing, but we don't always succeed. But that's what we try to do.
But there's a few levels to that, right? Like in your just example, just the fact that you're freaking home, right?
Mm.
That's one. Maybe I can speak for at least speak for myself as a latchkey child. Like nobody was home to hear my whimper. So I had to figure it out on my
On
own.
your own.
A lot of parents today, maybe because they work from home, who knows, right? Are home, but they don't have the intentionality. They're just too quick. And at least that's how I am.
Yeah.
Like maybe because I think my kid is just
Mm.
too young. I just taking too damn long. Dad's
Mm.
gotta go jump on a call. Let's just do this. So she gets super pissed when I do that. And I know, I get it. I understand. But it's tough to change habits or
Yeah.
I'm busy, right? But to have that third level that you're saying to just hold back first, but then hold back even more to let them figure it out. That
Right.
intentionality. Or another word I've heard is especially when you have parents that they've got their finances in order, they're a little bit more, present, intentional.
Yeah, that is true. We're blessed to be able to have the time and then the resources to be able to think about this stuff and learn from child psychologists, all these resources that are available to us now and we're not
Yeah,
available.
knowledge, resources, and money, right? Being
Yeah.
able to not have to work an 80-hour work week and be
Right.
home and not
Yeah.
energy-wise strung out.
To your point, it's definitely easier to have the bandwidth and the patience to be intentional about this kind of stuff. Whereas kids were very young and my wife and I were both working like 9 to 5 every day. When you get home, like you just don't have the bandwidth for certain things, and then you just react. But things get better once you have more time freedom. Like you have the resources, like you said, to be able to think, hey, am I doing things like the best way? Right? Is this the best for our children? Is the way that we were brought up? Is that really the best? Because that tends to be the default, is that a lot of the things that our methods that our parents use, they get passed on to us, and so that becomes a default, and then to be able to have that opportunity to reflect, like, "Hey, which pieces are good? Which pieces do I wanna keep? Which pieces do I wanna replace?" And set a new legacy. That definitely is a privilege.
To have the data points on knowing how things impact final product.
Any other thoughts or takeaways with this interesting type of swim class?
I think it never ends, right? Like
Mm,
whether it's trying not to drown when you're swimming or meeting new kids in elementary school or starting a business as an adult or starting a new career or having the balls to apply for a new job after you've been
yeah.
working one
Mhm.
for a while and you're in your comfort zone. They're all the same story, which is getting out of your comfort zone, trying something different. Kids have the ability to be unaware
Mm,
of the consequences of their failure with any venture. Adults are almost too aware of those consequences. And then part of the consequences is thinking what others think of them as they go through it, the failures.
yeah.
What if I buy a rental property and I tell my friends about it, which most people don't
Mm,
because it could go bad and then all their friends make fun of them because they bought a rental property and it didn't
yeah.
go too well.
Yeah, I think there's definitely this balance between gut instinct and also informed decision making. And I'll bring up a story that this conversation is making me think about is It relates to my daughter when a few years ago, we moved from New York across the continent to British Columbia. Right? We moved during the height of the pandemic, essentially. Everything was locked down, and New York, especially, was pretty crazy at that time. So for my 5-year-old, moving to BC wasn't just a change of scenery, but it was basically a leap into a very different way of life, especially because the way that the pandemic was handled here was in many ways very different than in New York. So for my daughter, she entered a new pre-K in the middle of the year where the mask wearing policy was basically like 180 from the mask policy in New York. So here in BC at that time, they were very intentional about making a point that kids that young should not be wearing masks because it interferes with their learning and development, which is a complete 180 from what she experienced in New York. And on top of that, she was at a Catholic school. So they were super strict. And we still remember seeing the makeshift morgues with the refrigerated trucks that were lined up outside the New York City hospital. So that was the area that we came from. And then to come here, and she goes to school on the first day and no one is wearing masks. In fact, the teachers are actually trying to get her to take off her mask so that she could blend in better. So they obviously mean, but for a 5-year-old coming from that environment, when they would talk about being confused. And so the more that they tried to get her to take off the mask, actually the worse it made it. She made her really upset and really anxious. And my wife and I, we actually talked about this and we ended up deciding that the best way is let her figure it out on her own, right? To your point about what we were just talking about. And we asked the teachers, hey, let's try backing off on trying to get her to take off her mask every day when she goes to school and then just see what happens. It's not going to hurt anyone. And lo and behold, interestingly, once they backed off, a few days later, she just naturally took off the mask in school and was just like any other normal kid. So that really, when I think about that, I think it made me realize there's actually a lot of parallels to what my daughter experienced and what I think a lot of newer investors or newer entrepreneurs face. It's that her decision to take off the mask wasn't based on any sort of whim. It was actually her intuition in action. She needed it to be informed by her mom and dad were doing, and then also what her brother doing, and also seeing what the teachers and the other students in her new environment were doing. So she was processing things in her own way.
Never asking you like, "Hey, I got this problem. I'm a little
Yeah,
conflicted
yeah.
here." They never ask.
Yeah, she processed this. And I think that the reason I bring up the story is that it's not just about my daughter like adapting to a new school, but it's about how like stepping into the unknown requires a combination of gut feeling, but also seeing the bigger picture, understanding nuances, and getting insights from those who actually have genuine experience. So in her example, I think she really looked to us and her brother because we were all new to the area as well. And I think that really helped her to process it as opposed to just listening to what the teachers at the school were saying, right? Because they didn't really understand the changes that were taking place in her world. And then let's not also forget that especially when it comes to new investors, entrepreneurs, they're going to get a ton of advice, right? From people who mean, but they actually haven't been in your shoes or actually gone through the journey that you're thinking of going through. In fact, I think you and I, we see this so commonly that it's like someone, they want to get into investing, right? Or they want to start a new business, but the people that they hang out with, their family, their old circle of friends, they end up holding you back, right? Because they mean, but they're giving you all this advice on something that they actually haven't done themselves. Yeah. And I think yeah, there's a lot of, I think, parallels between when I think back to how she adjusted and then the journey that a lot of, like, new people who are deciding, "Should I jump into this new investment? Should I jump into this new venture? Should I jump into the pool?"
Yeah. In a way, it's like artificial intelligence to some extent from your daughter's
Mm,
inputs. There may be like 4 or 5 influencers. Now, with an adult getting into something new, there's maybe 50, 100 times of influencers. Heck, you pull up YouTube or podcasts, there's a whole bunch of influencers there. And there is an aspect of red herrings and bad advice too, that by then the adult, somewhere between where your daughter is and where adults are, they need to build their own experience pool
mhm.
that they can have some kind of bearing themselves.
Yeah.
And that's, ladies and gentlemen, that's how you do AI. That's part of the development of that confidence and
Yeah.
experience, that inner part, right? Because the complexities and the influences are just going to multiply from there.
Yeah, and this is why I think it's so important for those of us with kids to keep this in mind is that you got to be careful about not doing everything for your kids. Right? You got to let them get in touch with their own inner wisdom, their own gut feeling. Let them make mistakes. Let them figure it out because like you said, when you get older, things are just going to get more complicated. You're going to have way more voices and the voices are stronger. And at the end of the day, it's really you versus your mind. Your mind is your biggest enemy in a lot of these cases. And to be able to have that mindset, to be able to trust that inner wisdom, that's so important when it comes time to do something that's off the beaten path. Right? When you're trying to do something that deep down you have to do, you want to do, but most of the people around you are saying, hey, that's crazy. You shouldn't be doing that. You should be sticking to the safe path. You should be sticking to certainty, stability. Stop thinking about these crazy ideas. Right? That's not how we did it.
That's a catch 22 is
Yeah.
when you have more than a couple of $1,000,000, you don't really need to get too much out of the beaten path, out of your comfort
Hmm.
zone and try different things. You don't need to make your own business. You don't need to do that type of stuff. It reminds me of another unrelated story that I've heard another investor mention that their kid, and I think sometimes this is just by chance, but the
Mm.
kid is very in tune to like they needed a car for college. So they were going to like research all this stuff, negotiate it with the dealership, like exactly what you want to do. But if you're flooded with cash and you don't have
Yeah.
the need to get a good deal, get whatever the magazine says you should be getting, then you don't have the motivation or there's no need to build that inner power that you're talking about.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's the unfortunate byproduct of living a life of less constraints.
Yeah, I think all the more important to be aware and really intentional about these potential pitfalls, right? Because the potential pitfalls that a lot of folks in similar situations they face, they're very different than the challenges that like a lot of our parents might have faced, especially if those of us who came from immigrant family backgrounds or families that weren't as well off. Like we all face challenges. The challenges are just different, and there's definitely risks involved in now having like more financial security.
Yeah. I mean, if your parents are never around and you have to make all the decisions on your own,
Yeah.
you're gonna build that muscle and
Mm.
add to the fact that you don't have money, where you're gonna get really scrappy with the amount of money that you
Mm.
have and probably go find ways to make money. Or like on the other hand, like our kids are gonna be the complete opposite. So maybe with abundance of resources and money and all that type of stuff, there needs to be more intention to holding that crucible and creating those constraints, even though they're
Right.
in a way they're soft constraints.
I completely agree.
Gotta be a hard ass, huh? I guess, or
Unfortunately.
is that yeah. Which is hard when it's so easy just to press the easy button and buy them that Range Rover. That makes no sense whenever you do a spreadsheet on the best car. Maybe I'll ask you the question. When you saw your daughter do that, did that kind of inspire you to do anything differently on your end? Like maybe apply some of that intuition to something you were working at the time or maybe now or
Yeah, if it wasn't an easy decision at the time between my wife and I, because we were figuring out what to do, right? Because every day that the teachers are coming to us, something's wrong, right? So we felt this pressure, almost felt like peer pressure too, from the teachers. It wasn't an easy decision, but I think we ended up making the right one, and now we ended up applying this to other things, right? So it's her learning to ski or like learning to ride a bicycle for the first time, and we just had faith that it's gonna work out. She's gonna be fine. She's gonna do things on her own timeline. And we found that every time that we've adopted this mindset, when we don't put any pressure or expectation on her, she figures it out and she ends up exceeding our expectations. And then to your question, I try to do the same, like in my own life, right? And sometimes I need to take a step back and say to myself, hey, don't force it. No one's pressuring you to do this. There's no timeline. There's no peer pressure. Any pressure that you're feeling, a lot of it is these internal voices, right? Again, it's based on previous upbringing and whatnot. And I do sometimes find that I have to remind myself, just go at your own pace. As long as you're moving forward, you're going to figure it out. It's going to be okay. Yeah, it's my daughter's story ended up, I always have that in my mind. It's actually instructive too, I think, for adults.
yeah, thinking back to my daughter's story of near drowning 7 to 9 times in a
Yeah.
10-minute period. I think my takeaway, she's always laughing through this. So I think when you're going through a tough time
Mhm.
or you're going through anything, to just be positive. Easy for them, right? It's harder for adults to do this. And then to the second part of it is like the idea of a chipper. If anybody who's done CrossFit before, like a
Mhm.
chipper is like a workout that's really long. You just chip away at it. You're supposed to take breaks here or there and just
Mm.
chip away at it. But in a way, learning a skill or doing a business or learning how to not drown for like an infant like that is just something that you just keep steadily working at it, small dosages, and just keep
Right.
going at it, have a positive attitude. And maybe, I don't know, people, we always try and bring this back to some kind of actionable takeaway. Maybe that kind of somewhat helpful to folks listening to whatever they're going through or the next thing. With that, I guess we'll catch you guys on the next podcast. If you guys have any other topic suggestions, let us know, or any guests that you'd like us to connect with. And we'll see you guys on the next episode.